The clock stopped at 3:33 in the morning. Anastasia Vaughn noticed the moment she rushed through the iron-banded doors of Aurelian Ashenvale's private chamber, her medical bag slung over one shoulder, her pulse hammering at the base of her throat in a way that had nothing to do with the sprinting she had just done through 3 floors of midnight black corridors. The antique grandfather clock against the far wall, a towering obsidian thing carved with wolves and moons and symbols she did not have a name for, had simply ceased. Its pendulum hung suspended mid-swing, as though the universe itself had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. The ornate hands were frozen at precisely 3:33, and the silence that poured from it was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums, that carried weight and intent, the kind that every instinct in a human body recognized as deeply, cosmically wrong. And Aurelian Ashenvale was dying on the floor. He was on his knees beside the window, one hand braced against the stone sill, the other pressed flat against his chest, his white hair falling forward across his face in silver curtains. Even like this, even folded against gravity and some agony she could not yet name, he was devastating to look at. 6 feet and 4 inches of centuries-old predator, alabaster-skinned, built like something a sculptor had made in worship of an older god, dressed in dark formal clothes that were now damp at the collar and the wrists. His lips were pale, his eyes, when he lifted them to her, were not the deep silver she had learned over the past 4 months. They were black. Black all the way through, iris and white alike, which meant the blood starvation had crossed a threshold, or the poison had, or both, and she had maybe 2 hours before the question of leaving became irrelevant, because there would be nothing left to leave behind. "Get out," he said, his voice still carrying that low, commanding resonance that vibrated in the chest cavity. Even now, even on his knees, "Anastasia, I am not asking." She set her bag on the floor, snapped it open, and pulled out her stethoscope. "I heard you the first 3 times you had Mireille tell me to leave. The answer is still no." His jaw tightened. The hand against the window sill cracked a groove into the stone without him seeming to notice. The clock stopped. "You understand what that means in this house. It means something is catastrophically wrong with you, and the building is reacting to it. I know." She crossed to him, and he flinched backward, which startled her more than anything, because she had seen Aurelian Ashenvale face down his father's court of 30 elder vampires without so much as a flicker of retreat. "I am not afraid of you," she said quietly. "I was not afraid of you on the night we met. I am not afraid of you now. Let me help you." The black eyes held hers for a long, scorched moment. Then the hand fell from his chest, and she saw the wound for the first time. It was not a bullet wound. She had treated bullet wounds, had treated silver burns, had treated the rare and terrible infections that came from cursed blades, all of it part of the shadowed education she had received over 4 months embedded with the Ashenvale court as its resident human physician, a position that had sounded either like an extraordinary opportunity or a suicide mission, depending on who in her life she told about it. What was carved into Aurelian's chest through his shirt was something else entirely. It was a blood glyph, seared rather than cut, the edges black and red in alternating rings, pulsing faintly in a way that living tissue absolutely should not pulse. She recognized it from the texts she had been quietly, obsessively studying since her 3rd week in this building. It was a silencing mark, an ancient one, applied with the intent not merely to weaken a vampire, but to sever them from their own blood power. to cut them off from the accumulated force of their lineage the way you might cut a wire, leaving the body intact and the essential self stranded without current. Someone had tried to exile Aurelian Ashenvale from his own immortal nature, and from the state of the frozen clock, from the cold that was spreading through the chamber like slow frost across glass. She had a terrifying suspicion that the attempt was succeeding. She pressed the stethoscope to his chest before he could object again, listening past the human-accustomed 2 beats for the single, deep rhythmic percussion of a vampire heart, the one that beat perhaps 15 times per minute and moved blood with the pressure of something ancient and vast. She heard it, faint, irregular, as though it was forgetting the steps to a dance it had performed for 600 years. "Who did this to you?" she said. "It was not a question. That is a matter for the court, Aurelian." She pulled back and looked directly at him. He tolerated very few people using his given name without his title preceding it. She had earned the right precisely because she had never once been intimidated enough to remember to add the Lord. "Who did this to you?" The black eyes searched her face. Something moved behind them that was not quite pain and not quite gratitude and existed in the complicated country between the two. "Veilethor," he said at last. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Veilethor Cress, the Ashenvale court's second elder, the vampire who sat at Aurelian's left hand at every formal gathering, who had smiled at Anastasia with too many teeth the night of her arrival and called her a charming little pet, who she had watched over 4 months with a persistent, evidence-based conviction that he was the single most dangerous individual in a building absolutely full of dangerous individuals. She had mentioned this to Aurelian exactly twice. Both times he had told her that her instincts were admirable, but her politics were insufficient, that Veilethor was bound by blood oath to the Ashenvale line, and that no blood oath in the old world had ever been broken. She did not say, "I told you so." This did not seem like the moment. "I need to understand the glyph," she said, pulling her bag closer and extracting the small leather journal she carried everywhere, the one with her medical notes layered over old-world supernatural notation. Silencing marks in the pre-court texts require a counter-inscription applied to the same site, but the reagents are specific. Blood of the afflicted's own line, still burning silver, and water drawn from beneath a threshold stone. "Do you have access to all 3 of those things in this building?" He stared at her. It was the particular stare she had come to recognize as the one he deployed when she had said something that surprised him, and surprise was apparently a sensation he had not experienced frequently in the previous 6 centuries. "You have been reading the archive? You gave me unrestricted access to the library. The general library. The archive is 3 levels below that and sealed with a blood lock. The blood lock responds to any physician's intent in proximity to a dying patient. Did you not know that? It is in the first volume of the Founding Codex." She met his stare without blinking. "I do not waste time, Aurelian, and I do not particularly enjoy being underprepared now. The 3 reagents. Do you have them?" For another long moment he looked at her with that unreadable, incandescent attention that she had spent 4 months trying to categorize and failing. Then the corner of his mouth moved barely in the direction of something that was not quite a smile and was somehow more affecting for that. "The silver is in the armory 3 corridors from here. The threshold stone is beneath this room, part of the foundation. The water can be drawn from it by cracking the floor. Here," he pressed one finger to the stones directly beneath the frozen clock, At the old seam, my blood I can provide. Then we begin. She stood, shrugged her coat back onto her shoulders, and held out one hand. Can you walk? He looked at her hand for precisely the span of 2 of his laboring heartbeats. Then he took it, and she felt the cold of him through her fingers, the deep, structural cold of something ancient running low, and she tightened her grip and pulled, and he rose, and the 2 of them moved toward the door together. She would not understand until much later, turning it over, in the privacy of her own thoughts, in the weeks and months that followed, exactly when she had fallen in love with Aurelian Ashenvale. It had not been the night they met, though that night had been the kind of thing that stamped itself permanently into memory. It had been a December evening 4 months ago, and she had been called by a very strange man in a very expensive suit to a private medical consultation at an address that turned out to be a brownstone building in the old district of the city that was considerably larger on the inside than its exterior suggested. The man in the suit had been Heir, who was Aurelian's personal secretary and general logistical mastermind, and the consultation had been to assess whether Anastasia, who specialized in rare and unusual hematological conditions at the city's foremost research hospital, might be interested in a residential contract position treating a select clientele whose medical needs were, as Heir had put it with admirable precision, outside the scope of conventional medicine. Anastasia had spent 4 years at that point, treating patients whose conditions baffled everyone else. She had a particular comfort with the impossible. She had said yes before she finished reading the contract. She had met Aurelian on her 3rd day in the building, in the great hall on the 2nd floor, and he had been exactly what she should have expected, and still was not remotely prepared for: white hair, white skin, eyes like polished silver coins, well above 6 feet, dressed in a dark shirt with the collar open, leaning against one of the carved stone pillars with his arms crossed, and an expression that communicated absolute, effortless authority as fluently as other people communicated breath. He had looked at her the way the ocean looked at a ship, assessing, patient, entirely certain of its own dimensions. "You are the doctor," he had said. "I am," she had replied. "And you are in the early stages of a silver toxicity response in your left hand. You should probably let me look at that." The silence that followed had been almost tangible. Heir, standing to one side, had gone very still. 2 guards near the door had exchanged a glance that suggested no one spoke to the air this way and remained entirely comfortable afterward. Aurelian had looked at his left hand. Then he had looked back at her with those silver eyes, and something had shifted in them, something that might have been interest arriving for the first time in a very long while, and he had uncrossed his arms and extended his hand and said, "Very well." That had been the beginning. She had treated his silver toxicity, which was the result of a diplomatic blade exchange that had gone slightly wrong, and then his court secretary Threnody had come to her with a fever that was genuinely puzzling, and then 3 of the younger blood-turned members of the household had presented with a shared bloodline illness that she had spent 2 weeks diagnosing and treating, and by the end of the first month, she had been so thoroughly embedded in the rhythms and necessities of the Ashenvale court that leaving had ceased to be a shape her mind reached for. But it was not any of the medicine that had done it. It was a Tuesday evening in the 5th week, when she had been working late in the small consulting room they had set aside for her, and she had heard a sound from the corridor that she recognized as someone in distress, trying very hard not to be heard. She had opened the door and found Aurelian standing in the hallway, with his back against the wall. His eyes closed, his face arranged in the iron composure he wore like armor, but his hands slightly open at his sides in the small unconscious gesture. She had come to associate with him carrying something too heavy to set down. She had not asked him what was wrong. She had simply leaned against the opposite wall and stayed. He had not spoken for several minutes. Then he had said, very quietly, "Today is the anniversary of my mother's death. She was the last person in this court who remembered what I was before the weight of the heir's obligation became the whole of it." She had not offered condolence or platitude. She had said, "What were you before?" And he had looked at her with those silver eyes in the quiet hallway, and he had talked for an hour about a younger version of himself, who had studied astronomy in the courts of old Vienna, who had loved music with an unfashionable intensity, who had read philosophy, not for strategy but for pleasure, who had been someone other than the apparatus of power the court required him to be. And she had listened the way she listened to everything completely, precisely, without the performative sympathy that would have closed him off like a door swinging shut. When he had finished, he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "You are very dangerous. Anastasia Vaughn." She had raised an eyebrow. "I have been told I am very small and not at all intimidating. Those people," he had said, "were not paying attention." She had thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it now, 3 months later, on the other side of that conversation, as she half supported him through the corridor toward the armory, watching his profile in the low lights of the hallway, the locked jaw, the absolute refusal to lean on her more than physics strictly required, the way he was maintaining the architecture of composure even now when he was fracturing from the inside out. "Tell me the full sequence," she said as they moved. Veilethor applied the silencing mark. "How did he get close enough? The blood oath should have made aggression against you impossible. He did not act directly. The words came with effort, not emotional effort. Physical talking was costing him. He used a proxied glyph, embedded it in the formal document I signed at tonight's court session, diplomatic papers for the Northern Alliance. The mark activated on contact with my signature." Anastasia processed this. A trap built into paperwork. He exploited the one moment when your guard was formally lowered. Ancient blood law mandates that all signatories in a formal court session lower their defensive wards. It is a holdover from a pre-diplomatic era when the act of signing was considered evidence of trust. He paused, steadying himself with one hand on the wall for 2 steps. "I should have seen it. You could not have seen it. It was designed specifically to be invisible within the law." She glanced at him sidelong. "How many people in this court know what has been done to you, Mireille? You. Veilethor, likely 2 of Veilethor's allies among the secondary council and your father." The silence was complicated. Aurelian's father, Aurelian Ashenvale, was the ruling patriarch of the court, a being of extraordinary age who had in Anastasia's assessment become considerably more interested in political stability than in the well-being of his heir. Their relationship was the kind of precise, loaded silence that existed in houses where love had calcified under the pressure of expectation over centuries. "My father," Aurelian said at last, "is the reason the blood oath was worded in a way that permitted proxied action. He negotiated the covenant language himself 3 centuries ago. Whether he knew then that it contained the loophole Veilethor has used, I have spent tonight trying not to consider." That landed heavily. She let it sit, The armory was a long, vaulted room that smelled of iron and something older, the mineral resonance of weapons that had passed through enough centuries to accumulate a gravity of their own. She found the silver stores exactly where he had directed her, a sealed cabinet of medical-grade purified silver, kept there for exactly the kind of situations the court's physician might require it. She had never accessed it before tonight. She loaded what she needed into a small case, checked the quantities against the formula she had transcribed from the archive 3 weeks ago on a night when some piece of intuition she could not name had told her to read that particular section, and turned back to Aurelian. He was standing at the window at the far end of the armory, looking out at the city below. The building occupied the borderline between the old district and the new, and from this height you could see the modern glass towers cutting the skyline above the Gothic stonework of the older streets, the two worlds cohabiting with the particular tension of things that have not yet decided whether they are compatible. The lights of the city threw silver and amber across his face in alternating planes, and he looked, in that moment, simultaneously, like the oldest thing she had ever stood near, and like something that was, beneath all the centuries and the politics and the weight of the heir's obligation, genuinely and achingly alive. She crossed to him and stood beside him at the window without speaking. After a moment he said, "You understand that if this works, if we counter the silencing mark, there will be a reckoning with Veilithor that will be neither clean nor quiet. He will not simply accept having been outmaneuvered. He will escalate. I know. There will be danger. Court politics at this level are not theoretical. I know that too, Anastasia." He turned from the window to look directly at her, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, something underneath the composure, something that was asking for something he did not know how to ask for. "You have no obligation to remain past this point. The contract I offered you 4 months ago did not include the possibility of becoming a target of court intrigue. I would not hold you to it. You could leave tonight, before anyone who matters to Veilithor knows how much you understand of what has happened here." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the careful, calibrated space he had maintained between them over 4 months, the precise professional consideration, the way he always positioned himself between her and any potential threat in a room without ever making a production of it, the way he had started. Leaving books he thought she might find interesting on the table, outside her consulting room. Without mentioning it, the way he had asked her once, very casually, what music she listened to when she worked, and the next morning there had been a very good speaker system installed in the consulting room, tuned to the station she had named. She thought about the hallway conversation and the silver eyes in the low light and the shape of him in this armory window with the city glittering behind him. It's like something had arranged the whole view specifically to break her heart. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not because of the contract, because I am choosing not to." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a different texture entirely. "Why?" he said, very quietly. "You know why," she said, and held his gaze, and watched something shift behind his eyes like tectonic plates making peace with each other after a long standoff, and she picked up her case and said, "Now let us go fix you before that clock damage becomes permanent. I will need your blood for the counter-inscription, and I want you conscious when I take it." He followed her out of the armory without another word, but his hand found the space at the small of her back as they moved through the door. a gesture so light and deliberate and careful that it might have been imagined, except that she felt it in every nerve in her body. They did not speak on the way back to his chamber. They did not need to. The threshold stone was exactly where he had said it would be, accessible through a narrow crack in the chamber floor that ran beneath the frozen clock. The stone was old volcanic rock, black and smooth, and the water that seeped from the seam was genuinely peculiar, cold as winter river water, and carrying a faint luminescence that Anastasia noted clinically and marveled at privately. She collected it in a sterile container from her bag, thinking, as she often did in this building, that her medical training had prepared her for a remarkable range of things, but had perhaps not anticipated this exact configuration of challenges. She arranged everything on the low stone table beside the window: silver, threshold water, her instruments, the formula open in her journal. Then she looked up at Aurelian, who was sitting on the edge of the window seat, watching her prepare with an expression that was very still and very attentive. "I need you to understand what this process involves," she said. "The counter-inscription has to be applied directly over the silencing mark, which means working on the wound site. It will hurt. I cannot give you anything for the pain because your physiology will metabolize anything fast-acting before it can help, and the slow-acting compounds in my kit will take longer to reach effect than we have time for. I will be as precise as I can, but I cannot make it painless. I have endured considerably worse," he said. "I am not saying it because I think you cannot bear it. I am saying it because I will know that you are in pain, and I want you to know that I know and that it matters to me." A pause. Then, very carefully, he said, "You are a remarkable person, Anastasia." "Save it for after," she said, pulling on her medical gloves. "Shirt off, please." There was a very brief moment in which the formality of the situation collided with the intimacy of it, and she kept her expression professionally neutral, and her hand steady and her attention on what she needed to do, because there was time for the rest of this later, and not enough time for what came next if she allowed herself to be distracted by the reality of Aurelian Ashenvale removing his shirt in the low candlelight of his private chamber. The wound was worse than she had thought at her initial examination. The silencing glyph covered a span from just below his left collarbone to the center of his sternum, and the outer edges had already begun spreading in the characteristic branching pattern that indicated the curse was trying to root itself deeper into his bloodline. She had perhaps 40 minutes before the roots passed a depth at which counter-inscription could reach them. She had been wrong about the 2 hours. She had significantly less time than she had told herself. She did not share this recalculation with him. "Blood first," she said. "The formula requires it as the binding agent. I will need a small amount from the site itself, which I know is unusual, but the counter-inscription has to recognize you specifically." She hesitated, not from doubt, but from professional courtesy. "I am going to have to ask you to trust me in a way that goes somewhat beyond the standard patient-physician relationship." "I already trust you," he said, simply, without embellishment. It landed in her chest like something being set down after a very long time of being carried. She worked quickly and precisely, with the focused attention she brought to every critical procedure, the kind of concentration that narrowed the world to the essential elements and cleared away everything peripheral. She applied the silver in solution to the glyph's outer boundary, tracing the counter pattern from her notes, speaking the activation language softly as she worked. the old-world words that she had been privately practicing for weeks, without being entirely sure why. The threshold water she applied at the midpoints of the inscription, where the original mark's energy concentrated in the pulsing nodes she could see with the unaided eye. Aurelian was absolutely still under her hands, his breathing controlled and deliberate, his eyes fixed somewhere above her, enduring. Once, in the middle of the most invasive portion of the work, he exhaled very slowly through his teeth, and she felt a vibration go through the muscle under her hands, a single shudder of pain he had not managed to suppress entirely. And she said, without stopping, "I have you." Keep breathing, and the shudder passed, and he was still again. The glyph resisted. It had been well made, designed by someone who understood the old formulae with genuine expertise, and for approximately 4 minutes it pushed back against the counter-inscription with a force she could actually feel through her instruments, a pressure against her hands that seemed to come not from anything physical, but from some deeper current in the room. The clock remained frozen. The cold deepened. Aurelian's jaw was locked. His eyes had gone very dark, and she pressed on, adjusting her angles, redirecting the silver compound along the secondary channels of the glyph's structure, following the logic of its own design back against it. Then something gave. It was like a knot releasing. The pulsing in the wound ceased between one breath and the next. The spreading boundary retracted, and from across the room, with a sound like a single deep note struck on a very large bell, the grandfather clock began to move again. The pendulum swung once, twice. The hands resumed their journey from 3:33, and the room exhaled, and the cold lifted off the air in stages, and Aurelian's eyes, when he looked down at her from wherever his attention had been fixed through the procedure, was silver again. She checked the sight. The glyph was fading, the black and red rings losing definition, the branching roots retracting. It would be gone entirely within the hour, leaving only the faint residue that might persist for a few weeks, and would then disappear completely. She was fairly sure. She was 90% sure. She would monitor it regardless. "Done," she said, and she heard the controlled relief in her own voice and did not try to hide it. Aurelian looked at the sight on his chest. Then he looked at her. Then he did something she had not seen him do in 4 months. He reached out and put both his hands around hers, carefully, completely. The cold of him wrapped around the warmth of her, and he stayed there, and she let him, because she was also slightly shaking, and the contact helped. "You read a counter-inscription for a centuries-old silencing curse," he said, "from memory in the original language while working on a wound site under time pressure. On your 3rd attempt, because you recalibrated twice, I was hoping you did not notice the recalibrations. I noticed everything." A pause. "I always notice everything about you." She looked up at him. The clock was ticking again, measured and steady, and the candles in the room had steadied from the trembling they had been doing in the current of whatever energy the curse had been moving, and the city lights still made patterns across the stone floor. And Aurelian Ashenvale was looking at her with 600 years of controlled restraint, doing something she had never seen it do before, which was failing. "There is something I have not said to you," he began. "I know," she said. "I am attempting to say it now. I know that too." His hands tightened fractionally around hers. The silver eyes searched her face with an intensity that was not threatening but was certainly not small. "In 6 centuries," he said, very carefully, "I have not once brought a human into this court with any purpose beyond the pragmatic. I told myself your contract was pragmatic. I told myself every adjustment I made to this building to suit your preferences was pragmatic. I told myself that every conversation we had that ran past midnight into the hours when I should have sent you to your rooms was pragmatic. A brief pause. I have been lying to myself for approximately 3.5 months. Something warm moved through her chest, complicated and full and thoroughly inconvenient. Only 3.5, she said. It took me about 3 weeks. The expression that crossed his face was one she had never seen on him before. It was entirely unguarded, it was, she realized with a start, happiness, genuine and undefended, arriving on a face that had worn composure for so long that happiness looked slightly foreign there, like sunlight in a room that had been shuttered for decades. Then his expression shifted, and the happiness was still present, but something else came in alongside it. Something that was old and complicated, and that she recognized as the thing that always arrived in him when something good was happening, the shadow of the cost. "Veilithor," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "We need to deal with Veilithor." They dealt with Veilithor at dawn, not immediately at dawn, because several things had to occur first. Aurelian needed an hour of recovery, which he spent not lying down, as she suggested, but sitting at his desk making quiet. Precise notes that she suspected were the architecture of a plan too intricate for her to fully follow, but which she watched him build with the focused admiration of someone watching a master at work. She sat across from him with her own notes open, cross-referencing what she had observed about Veilithor's behavior over 4 months against the timeline she could now construct of the plot, looking for the markers she had missed or had not been in a position to act on. Mireille was summoned at 4 in the morning and arrived in immaculate formal clothes that suggested either they had not yet slept or they dressed this way as a reflex. Anastasia liked Mireille considerably, primarily because Mireille treated her with the particular brisk competence reserved for colleagues rather than the careful, slightly weighted courtesy the rest of the court extended to her as a human outsider. Mireille looked at the healed wound site at the silent clock and at Anastasia's medical notes open on the table and said simply, "The archive counter-inscription. I wondered if you would find it. You knew it was there," Anastasia said. "I knew it was there, and I knew what Veilithor had been constructing, and I knew that formal court channels would not reach it before he acted. Blood law protects the process of formal accusation to a degree that makes it nearly impossible to intercept a plotted crime before it lands." Mireille set a small sealed packet on the desk. "This is what I have collected over the past 6 weeks. Document by document evidence of the proxied glyph preparation and the meeting between Veilithor and 3 secondary council members. In the lower city building Veilithor owns under a historical alias. I was waiting for an opportunity to present it to you without Veilithor being able to claim it was fabricated under adversarial conditions. An attempted silencing is the opportunity." Aurelian looked at the packet, then at Mireille, then at Anastasia. "You both," he said slowly, "were independently building cases against Veilithor." "You were not listening to me," Anastasia said. "I should have been," he said, and his voice carried something that in someone less constitutionally committed to composure would have been sheepishness. The formal blood court convened at 6 in the morning, which was the designated hour for urgent matters that required the full tribunal's presence. All 30 members were required to attend, which meant Veilithor was in the room when Aurelian presented the evidence. Anastasia watched from the physician's gallery above the court floor, which was her designated position at formal sessions, elevated and separated from the political action below in a way that had always mildly frustrated her, and today proved at least that she was out of immediate reach. Veilethor, when the evidence was laid before the tribunal, did something neither she nor Aurelian had fully anticipated. He admitted it. He stood in the center of the court floor in his formal robes, pale-haired and cold-eyed and wholly composed, and he said that yes, he had applied the silencing mark, that he had done so because the Ashenvale heir had been steering the court toward a political alliance that, in Veilethor's assessment, would destroy the northern bloodlines within 2 generations, that he had acted on an ancient blood law precedent that permitted any court elder to challenge a ruling heir's blood authority if the elder believed the heir's decisions constituted an existential threat to the court, and that he was prepared to submit to the tribunal's judgment. It was, Anastasia thought from the gallery, an extraordinarily bold move. He was not fleeing or deflecting. He was reframing his attack as a blood law challenge, turning a criminal act into a political one, forcing the tribunal into a procedural question rather than a moral one. She watched Aurelian's face from across the room. He had known, she realized. He had anticipated this exact reframing, which was why the plan he had been building at his desk at 4 in the morning had been so intricate. He stood at the head of the court, with his hands at his sides and his expression, carrying that particular quality of absolute authority she had first observed in the great hall 4 months ago. Only now it was underpinned by something that had been refreshed rather than diminished by the night's events, by the counter-inscription and the clock's resumption and the choice Anastasia had made to stay. The precedent Veilethor cites, Aurelian said, addressing the tribunal, is accurate. Blood law does permit a challenge of heirs' blood authority. However, the precedent requires that the challenge be registered formally and openly through the tribunal before action is taken. A proxied glyph embedded in a diplomatic document is not an open formal challenge. It is a covert strike. The distinction is not procedural. It is foundational. He paused. Furthermore, the blood law precedent he names was authored by the same founding covenant that binds every elder in this court to the principle that authority exercised through deception is authority forfeited. Veilethor's actions, by the terms of his own cited precedent, invalidate his standing to raise the challenge at all. The silence in the court was the particular quality of something settling, of a structure finding its proper shape. Lord Valdris Ashenvale, who had been sitting at the head of the elder section with the stillness of very old stone throughout the proceedings, spoke then for the first time. His voice was lower and older than his son's, carrying the resonance of considerably more centuries, and it said, "The tribunal will note that the heir's assessment is legally complete. Veilethor's challenge is invalidated by its own method of application. The matter of penalty will follow standard tribunal process." Veilethor looked up at the patriarch, and for the first time something moved in his face that was not composure. He had not expected the patriarch to close the door on him. He had, Anastasia suspected from everything she had observed, expected the patriarch's ambivalence about his son to create enough of a gap for the reframing to work. He had miscalculated, perhaps because he had not accounted for the night's events unfolding as they had. Later, when she asked Aurelian about his father's intervention, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father came to my chamber at 5 in the morning, while you were reviewing notes in the consulting room. He had been told of the silencing mark by one of his own secondary sources. And he came, and we had a conversation that I do not have the words for yet. But he said that whatever political calculus he had permitted himself regarding Veilithor's usefulness, it did not extend to permitting an attempt on his heir's fundamental nature, that there were things that outweighed the calculus. Another pause. It is, perhaps, the most direct statement of paternal regard I have received from him in approximately 150 years. I am still processing it. Anastasia said nothing. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, and he covered it with his, briefly, and they left it that Veilithor was formally stripped of his court, standing and blood-bound to a territorial exile, which Mireille explained to Anastasia was the vampire equivalent of being exiled with guarantees, the blood-binding meaning that any attempt to return to the court or act against its members would carry automatic, supernatural consequence. It was not a death sentence. Aurelian had argued against that, citing old-world law and his own particular conviction that courts that executed challengers rather than exiling them became courts that feared challenge rather than courts that withstood it. Anastasia had found this deeply characteristic of him, the way he governed his arguments with principles, even in moments where vengeance would have been completely understandable. The 3 secondary council members who had been part of Veilithor's planning were subjected to separate proceedings, which Anastasia was not present for, but which Mireille summarized for her over tea in the consulting room that afternoon, with the brisk efficiency of a briefing document. 2 received reduced penalties in exchange for full disclosure of the plot's timeline. 1 did not cooperate and received the blood exile in full. By the afternoon of the day following the night of the stopped clock, the Ashenvale court had the particular quality of something that has moved through a violent pressure system and come out the other side into clear air, tense, uncertain, but fundamentally intact. Anastasia sat in her consulting room in the late afternoon light and wrote up her clinical notes from the previous night with the thoroughness she applied to everything, because whatever else happened, the counter-inscription procedure needed to be fully documented for future reference. She noted the reagents, the timing, the recalibrations, the observed progression of the glyph's dissolution, the resumption of the clock as a marker of the patient's restored blood authority. She wrote it in the precise, dry clinical language she used for all her notes, and did not allow herself to think about the part where Aurelian had held her hands in his and said, "I always notice everything about you," because that was not clinical documentation, and she needed to finish the actual clinical documentation first. She was on the 3rd page of notes when there was a knock at the consulting room door. "Come in," she said, expecting Mireille. It was Aurelian. He was wearing different clothes from the night before, a dark jacket over a grey shirt, and his white hair was pulled back in the way he wore it when he was not being formally presented to the court, and he was carrying, with the careful precision of someone handling something unexpectedly fragile, a cup of tea. She looked at the tea, she looked at him. "Mireille told me," he said with great dignity, "that you have not eaten or slept since yesterday afternoon. Mireille is a very reliable source of information. Mireille is an extraordinary person, and I am grateful for them." He crossed the room and set the tea on the edge of her desk with careful attention to not disrupting her notes. And then he stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked slightly uncertain in a way that she found absolutely devastating on someone who was the rest of the time the single most effortlessly certain presence she had ever encountered. I came to say several things, he said, and I am aware that some of them are more complex than others, and that now may not be the right time for the more complex ones. We have time, she said. The emergency is resolved. Yes, he looked at her. The less complex things first. Thank you for the counter-inscription, for the archive and the formula and the threshold water, for refusing to leave. His voice was very even and very precise, and she could hear underneath it exactly how much the words were carrying. For the 4 months before this, for hearing me in the hallway on the November anniversary, for not being afraid of me when most people. Ah, for treating my court as though they are worth the full attention of your abilities, because they are, and I wanted that for them long before I admitted that I wanted it for myself. She had put her pen down somewhere in the middle of that, and she was just looking at him. He was 600 years old, give or take, a vampire heir with the blood authority of one of the oldest courts in the Northern Territories, a being around whom rooms rearranged themselves in terms of power and gravity without him having to try. And he was standing in her consulting room, holding his own hands in his pockets, like a person who had gone to considerable trouble to build up to saying something, and was now that moment arrived experiencing the specific vulnerability of having arrived. The more complex things, she said softly. He exhaled, one breath, deliberate. I do not know the appropriate framework for this. I am aware that I am considerably older than you. I am aware that what I am places certain constraints on any sustained relationship with a human person, constraints that are real and not trivial, and that require honest conversation rather than being glossed over by the momentum of a feeling. He met her eyes. I am also aware that I have spent a significant portion of the last 4 months finding reasons to be in whatever room you were in, and that when the clock stopped last night, the first thought I had before anything else was that I did not want you to see what was happening to me, because I could not bear for you to be afraid. And then you walked in, and you were not afraid, and you said, I know what the clock means, and I am not leaving. And I understood that the honest conversation needed to happen as soon as the emergency allowed it. She stood up from her desk. She crossed the room to him. She was considerably shorter than him, which had struck her as a logistical observation. The first time she had stood close to him and now registered as a different kind of observation entirely. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the afternoon light came through the consulting room window in long gold planes, and she said, You are correct that there are real constraints and that they require honest conversation. I am a physician. I think about long-term outcomes for a living. I know what you are, and I know what I am, and I am not saying any of this from a position of naivety about what it means. I know you are not, he said. I am also a person who, when faced with a choice between leaving and staying in the middle of something terrifying, consistently chooses to stay and address the terrifying thing. I have been aware of this about myself for some time. She held his gaze. I am not going to pretend that the constraints are not real, but I am also not going to let the constraints be the reason I walk away from something that I would otherwise choose. You would otherwise choose, he repeated, very carefully, as though confirming the precise meaning of each word. I would otherwise choose, she said. He lifted one hand and touched her face, very gently, the back of his fingers against her cheekbone. The cold of him which no longer felt like absence, but like its own specific and familiar quality, and he said her name, Anastasia, with the particular care of someone speaking something. They have been keeping very quietly for a considerable amount of time, and she turned her face slightly into his hand and said, "I know." They stayed like that for a moment, in the consulting room, with the afternoon light and the open medical notes on the desk, and the tea going slightly cold, and all the accumulated weight of 4 months of careful proximity finding its proper resolution at last. Then he lowered his head and kissed her, with the same characteristic quality he brought to everything, which was thorough and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself, and she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, which was complete attention and no equivocation whatsoever. The weeks that followed were not without complication. The aftermath of Veilithor's removal required a significant restructuring of the secondary council, and Aurelian was occupied with this in ways that filled his days and a portion of his nights, and Anastasia was simultaneously managing the court's medical needs, which had in the aftermath of the political upheaval spiked considerably, as stress manifested in vampire physiology, in ways she found clinically fascinating and professionally demanding. There were late nights working on opposite sides of a shared table, her medical notes and his political documents, cohabiting in the comfortable silence of two people who had reached the part of knowing each other, where silence was a form of communication rather than an absence of it. Mireille observed all of this with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for the obvious to become official, and had the deep satisfaction of the profoundly right being proven correct. Mireille said nothing pointed about it, which Anastasia appreciated, but on the morning following the first night that Anastasia fell asleep on the library sofa while working late and woke to find a blanket over her, and Aurelian reading quietly in the chair across from her with the specific contentment of someone exactly where they want to be. Mireille set an extra cup of coffee on the table without comment, and that was sufficient. Aurelian's father requested a formal meeting with her 6 weeks after the night of the stopped clock. She prepared for this with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, which in this case involved rereading 3 volumes of Ashenvale court history, reviewing Valdres Ashenvale's formal decisions over the previous century for the philosophical patterns they revealed, and making a list of the most probable conversational territories and her positions on each. Lord Valdres received her in his study on the highest floor of the building, a room that smelled of books and old stone and something indefinably ancient. He was taller than his son and considerably older in the face, carrying the extra centuries in a way that was less the drawn quality of age than the settled quality of something that had long ago stopped needing to prove itself. He looked at her with silver eyes that were darker than Aurelian's nearly grey, and he said, "You saved my son's life." "I performed a medical counter-procedure," she said. "The archive had the formula. The reagents were available. The technical knowledge was the product of your own court's records. The technical knowledge without the determination to apply it under those conditions would have been irrelevant." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am told you refused to leave 3 times. "Yes." Something moved in his face, the first thing that had moved in it since she sat down, something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. "My son," he said carefully, "has spent 6 centuries treating his own emotional life as a secondary function. Something to be addressed once the political demands allowed time for it, which of course they never did. I have not been helpful to him in this regard. I believed for a very long time that the heir's role required a particular kind of aloneness. I was wrong, and I was too late to tell his mother so. A pause. I am not going to be too late again. She did not look away from him. What are you telling me? That you are welcome in this court, not merely as physician, but as whatever you choose to become within it. That I will not stand between my son and the first real choice he has made for himself in longer than I care to count. And that the blood law traditions regarding human partnership within a vampire court are old and complex but not insurmountable, and I will put the resources of the Patriarch's office toward clearing the relevant legal paths if and when they are needed. He regarded her. I am also telling you, because I believe you would want to know, that the treaty Valithor objected to is sound. Aurelian's political judgment has been correct throughout. Valithor's objection was not in good faith. The alliance will proceed. She absorbed all of this, then she said, "Thank you for the transparency. I believe you deserve it," he said. "You are, among other things, extremely difficult to deceive, and attempting to manage you through selective information would be both disrespectful and counterproductive." She left that meeting feeling a very particular kind of settled that she associated with foundations being confirmed solid under one's feet. She told Aurelian about the meeting that evening. They were in the library, their current default habitat, him with a map of the Northern Territories, and her with her most recent journal article draft, and she relayed the conversation, and he listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered considerably, and when she finished, there was a pause, and then he set down the map and looked at her with something in his face that was complicated with old grief and something newer and warmer. "He came to my chamber at 5 in the morning, he said, which she recognized as a return to what he had said before, something he was circling back to now with more words available for it. And he said that some things outweigh the calculus. And what I did not tell you then was that I asked him why, and he said that he had watched, over 4 months, as this court became something different, that it had become a place where his son came back from political meetings still himself, rather than gradually becoming the architecture of the role. That whatever you had done or not done, whatever you were or were not to me, you had somehow reminded me that the heir's obligation and the person fulfilling it were not the same thing, and that this was a thing he had never managed to give me himself, and he was grateful that someone had. She looked at him across the library table, at the white hair loose around his shoulders, in the informal evening version of him she had come to know over 4 months, and which she was fairly certain very few people in the history of the court had seen, at the silver eyes that were watching her with the full attention she had never once felt herself to be lacking since the moment they met, at the person who was 600 years of history and choice and grief and honor wrapped around something that was at its essential core exactly what he had told her about in that hallway in November, still present beneath everything, still alive. "Your father," she said, "is more remarkable than he wants people to know." "He is," Aurelian agreed. "It is a family tendency." She threw a small piece of notepaper at him. He caught it without looking, with the reflexive precision of something that had been a predator for 6 centuries. And the expression on his face was the unguarded happiness again, the kind that looked like it was still adjusting to being allowed out. The formal court recognition of their partnership came 3 months after that, which was fast by Ashenvale court standards and roughly light by the standards of old-world blood law, a pace that Anastasia suspected was the direct result of Lord Valdris personally reviewing the relevant precedents and removing obstacles before they could calcify into tradition. The ceremony was old world and elaborate and involved several components that were entirely outside her cultural reference points. And Mireille briefed her on each one with the thoroughness she had always appreciated. And Aurelian stood beside her through the formal portions with his hand at the small of her back, the same gesture he had first made in the armory doorway on the night of the stopped clock, and every time she felt it, she thought about how much had been contained in that first gesture and how much more was contained in it now. There was one moment in the ceremony that she had not been briefed on because it was not in any formal protocol document. It was the moment when, after the blood law declarations had been made and the formal recognition acknowledged by the tribunal, Aurelian turned to her away from the court. In that small private angle that exists between two people, even in a crowded room, and said in a low voice meant only for her, "I need you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "When the clock stopped," he said, "the first thing I thought was that I needed to get you out of the building, and then you walked through the door, and the second thing I thought, which replaced the first thing entirely and has not left since, was that you walking through that door was the most important thing that has ever happened in that room, including everything that room has witnessed in the 6 centuries it has been mine, and I do not say that lightly given the room's history." She looked at him. The court was still arranged around them, formal and ancient and watchful, and she was a human doctor from a research hospital, standing in the center of one of the oldest vampire courts in the Northern Territories, having just been formally recognized as the heir's partner under blood law, and all of that was true and real and slightly vertiginous when she looked at it all at once. And also true and real was the person standing in front of her, who was watching her with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who had all of time and was choosing to spend this particular piece of it looking at her. "I know," she said, for the 3rd time in the arc of them, the same words she had been saying to him since the consulting room afternoon, because it was still true. She did know. She had known from the beginning in the particular way she knew things, precisely and completely and without the need for the knowing to be louder than it already was. He smiled at her then, fully, without restraint, the kind of smile she had been waiting to see since the first time she had seen the corner of his mouth consider it and change its mind. It transformed his face entirely. It made him look like the person who had studied astronomy in old Vienna and read philosophy for pleasure, the person underneath the centuries of authority, present and fully here. She thought she could spend a very long time looking at that smile and not exhaust it. She took his hand. The court around them registered this. 30 pairs of old eyes in a vaulted room, heavy with the weight of centuries and politics and blood law and all the complicated machinery of ancient governance. And for a moment it was simply 2 people in the middle of all of that, holding on. Then Aurelian turned back to the court with her hand in his, and the full weight of his authority came back into his bearing, but differently now, not as a wall, but as a presence. And the court watched this and knew what it meant, what had changed, what was now the shape of things going forward. Mireille, from their position at the edge of the formal arrangement, met Anastasia's eyes across the room and gave a single small nod that communicated, with the efficiency she brought to everything, precisely the right amount of "I knew it would turn out this way" and nothing more. In the months that followed, the Ashenvale court underwent the kind of gradual shift that comes not from a single dramatic event, but from the accumulated effect of many smaller ones. The Northern Alliance Treaty was finalized and proved as sound as Aurelian had predicted. The Secondary Council was rebuilt with members whose selection process now included, informally but consequentially, Anastasia's assessment of their observed behavior in neutral social settings, which she had never offered to provide, and which Aurelian had never formally requested, but which he had simply, gradually, begun to integrate into his own judgment in the way that two people's thinking becomes entwined. When they are paying close attention to the same world from slightly different angles. She continued her medical work, expanded it, brought in 2 additional human physicians to the court's permanent staff, once the blood law framework for human professional residency was properly established, trained them in the supplementary Old World medical knowledge that the archive contained, and that she had by this point substantially mastered. She wrote 3 papers on vampire hematological conditions for the Research Hospital's restricted medical journal, the one that existed for the small community of physicians who worked in the complicated intersection between human medicine and the supernatural world that most people still officially considered fictional. The papers were received as the most significant contributions to the field in 2 decades, and she received them with the same composure she brought to everything, filed the congratulatory messages, and went back to work. The grandfather clock in Aurelian's chamber never stopped again. She noticed this specifically and precisely the way she noticed everything, because she had taken the habit of spending time in that chamber in the evenings when the day's various demands had been attended to, sitting in the window seat while Aurelian read or wrote at his desk, the 2 of them occupying the same quiet in the way they had occupied it in the library, comfortably, without the need for every moment to be narrated. The clock ticked steadily in the background, its pendulum moving in its regular arc, the obsidian wolves and moons carved into its case acquiring a familiarity over time that stripped them of their initial strangeness and rendered them simply part of the landscape of a place she had come to know. There was a particular evening in the autumn of the following year when she was sitting in that window seat, watching the city lights come up as the dark came down, and Aurelian came to sit beside her, which he did sometimes, the window seat, being large enough for 2 in the kind of architectural generosity that old buildings occasionally produced as though by forethought. He sat close enough that she could feel the specific quality of the cold that was him, the cold she no longer thought of as temperature but as presence, and she leaned against his shoulder without ceremony, and he put his arm around her with the ease of something they had been doing long enough that it required no decision, and they watched the city together. After a while, he said, "I have been thinking about something you told me in November. The first November, in the hallway." She remembered the hallway. "What about it?" "You asked me what I was before the weight of the obligation became the whole of it. And I told you about Vienna, about the astronomy, about the philosophy, and I have been thinking that those things were never actually lost. They only needed somewhere to go." He looked down at her. "They have somewhere to go now." She turned her head to look up at him. The city lights moved across his face, silver and amber, the same planes she had watched on the night of the stopped clock in the armory window, but different now, carrying different weight, the weight of someone not in crisis, but simply in the accumulated good of a life that had found its proper shape. He was looking at her with the full unhurried attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him and had never stopped being affecting. Even now, even after all this time, perhaps especially now. The astronomy, she said, I have always wanted to understand it better. The old methods, before the telescopes. I could teach you, he said, with a simplicity that was the most eloquent thing she had heard him say. Yes, she said, you could. He kissed her then, there in the window seat with the city, making its patient, glittering argument below them. And she put her hand against his chest, above the place where the silencing mark had been, and was not any more, and felt the slow, deep percussion of his heart, 15 beats per minute, steady and certain and ancient and fully present. And she thought about the night the clock stopped, and the choice she had made to stay, and understood that every choice since then had been the same choice, the one she would keep making, and that it was, from every angle, she could bring her precision to bear on, exactly right. The clock on the far wall ticked in its steady arc. The pendulum swung. The city lights shifted in their slow evening progression from the amber of early dark to the deeper silver of late night. Outside, the old district and the new city coexisted in their ongoing negotiation of what it meant to occupy the same world with different origins and different natures, and the same fundamental requirement, which was that things worth keeping required, choosing again and again. In full knowledge of all the costs, she had full knowledge of all the costs. She had chosen anyway. And Aurelian Ashenvale, 6 centuries old and counting, the heir of an ancient court, a being of considerable power and considerable history, and a nature that most of the world did not believe existed, held her close in the window seat of his chamber while the clock kept faithful time behind them, and felt, in the particular region of himself where the silence marks had tried to root and failed, something that had been growing since a December evening a year ago, when a small, extraordinarily capable human physician had looked at his hand and told him he needed to let her look at it, something that was warm where he had been cold for a very long time, and certain where he had been uncertain in all the ways that mattered, and which had no name in any language he had learned in 6 centuries, that was fully adequate to what it was. He held her, and the clock ticked, and the city breathed below, and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything.